Outstanding. So, hi everyone. That was Yuri Ito, who, along with me, Adam Shostack, are responsible for this Ostrom workshop on cyber public health, co-presented with CyberGreen. And today I have the weird pleasure of introducing my collaborator and myself. And so we are kicking off this fall's series of workshops. Um, we did take some feedback into account from some of our UK collaborators. Hopefully, we are at a better time for you. I see Audrey nodding there. Welcome back. And
Feel welcome.
today I want to share some work that Josiah and I did. Josiah presented this most recently at the New Security Paradigms workshop. But this is really something we are workshopping: handling pandemic scale cyber threats, lessons from COVID-19. And we're really hoping today to lead an interactive discussion where we get feedback from everyone on where this work might take us. And so, Josiah, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. Glad to be back. I've been attending some of these workshops. We presented some work, different work, a couple of months ago. Glad to be here talking about this. My name is Josiah. I work for a company called Trail Bits. I spent about 19 years before that in government, and this is a topic sort of unrelated to both. It is one that I thought was interesting. Adam and I have been talking about it for, I don't know, 18 months or something, not an insignificant amount of time. And I will echo Adam's sentiment that it's not finished. We want feedback. We got feedback at a workshop last week, and we have a print version of the document. I'll put this link in the chat as well. You can read a version of the paper there, but it won't be the last version. So if you want to refer to that, or if you want to read it after today's conversation, please feel free. So let me start with sort of the structure we're going to do is to give you a little bit of motivation. How did we get here? Why this topic? And then to devote some time to each of the lessons that we took away from a particular book about COVID-19 that I'll present here in a second. But love to get your feedback as we go along. Don't wait till the end to interrupt and ask questions about what did we get right, wrong, and particularly what can we do about it. So the end of the presentation here is really a call to what did we pick the right options? What else could we do? Our motivation was really motivated by trying to learn lessons from other domains. Cyber public health has been that. COVID-19 provided a very recent, real example of how the biological world dealt with a pandemic scale event, one that impacted billions of people on the planet, the largest in recent memory like this. And some things went well and some things did not go well. And lots of people have started to document what could we do better next time, because there will certainly be a next time. That intuition led us to think about sort of similar, for definitions we'll get into, events in the digital world. What would it mean to have an event that impacted billions of people's use of the internet or their smartphone or another digital technology that we rely on? Again, in one that requires them to change their behavior. In the biological pandemic, some of us go to work. Some people couldn't go out of the house. We couldn't sometimes go to school. It changed a lot of people's lives. What would happen if that happened in the digital world? What would trigger that? What would that look like? And we tried to look, not to start from scratch, but to say, what did people learn about COVID that is relevant to cyber? And Adam brought to my attention this book, which is one of several that tries to document lessons from COVID-19. The group who wrote this book, the COVID Crisis Group, sort of self-assembled to be ready to be the US commission that studied the US response to COVID. There was a 9/11 commission, for example, that studied the US's response in 9/11. This group of former government, high-level academics, leaders across the spectrum sort of were ready and had started to do this work, and for many reasons have never been assembled as a commission, as a formal US government commission. So because they did a lot of work, they ended up self-publishing this book, which is the things they probably would have raised in an official government commission. Now, this book is full of stuff, and Adam and I both sort of read it independently and came up with some themes that we thought were relevant to cyber. And we're going to go through each of them here in the next couple of slides, but these are the 6 that we highlight in the paper that we think provide insights for preparing for pandemic scale cyber events. The bottom line up front is that we believe there's insufficient preparations for this kind of event in cyber. There isn't a government playbook. To our knowledge, there aren't company playbooks for, again, very, very large scale events. We would be happy to argue about whether those have happened yet or not. Our view is that they have not yet happened, even though there have been large scale outages and incidents of other varieties. But where we're going to come back to at the end of the hour is the playbook the right thing? And if it is, how can we make it the most successful? Adam, maybe I'll have you say a bit here about pandemic scale.
Sure. Actually, if we could go back to the previous slide for just a minute. One of the things that I'd like to make sure the door is open for is, do we have the right 6 lessons? Are there places where, in your consideration and your perspective, we're missing a key lesson from the pandemic? And so while we have 6, that's what we came to as Josiah and I collaborated. It's not necessarily the right answer, although we think it's a defensible one. We're eager to hear others that might be worth being high-level lessons. And so with that, let's talk about pandemic scale events, because when we started talking, I'm going to admit I was skeptical about this topic, and I argued that we didn't have a clear sense of what pandemic scale really meant. And through collaboration, we came to the definition of a large scale impacting behavior for an extended period of time, essence of a definition. And we've had things that people will regularly argue with us were those really bad events that should be counted. And historically, the summer of worms. This was the summer of 2001 when we had worms like Slammer and Blaster that had a substantial impact on internet operations for a good couple of days, had dramatic impacts on Microsoft and then the software industry as a whole in bringing about secure software development at scale. But I think I want to argue, and actually I don't think I want to argue, I know I want to argue that these events were not, to my mind, on the same order of magnitude as the COVID pandemic. We didn't change our lives because of these. And so we can imagine events that are really much worse. And one way of doing this is to take advantage of CrowdStrike. And CrowdStrike took down a fairly large number of computers, 8.5 million, but they were recoverable. It was a lot of work for a lot of IT people, and I don't want to minimize that. But a week later, almost all of those 8.5 million computers were back online. In that time, there were banking issues, there were flight issues, there were other things. If those 8.5 million computers had not been salvageable, what might have happened? And I think we can imagine the event having been worse than we actually experienced. And those of you who know me know I'm super interested in near misses. And it feels a little weird to describe CrowdStrike as a near miss, but if we put it in that bucket and we say, how could that have gone even worse? There's some pretty obvious answers. So there's some ways to think about what a really bad event might be. For example, there's a thing called a Carrington event, which is the sun ejects a whole mass of coronal matter, destroys all the satellites, fries electronics on the ground, and destroying a lot of satellites would take a long time to replace. You know, today's news reminds us of just how useful weather satellites are. And if we didn't have weather satellites, our ability to predict the weather, or if we didn't have communication satellites, a lot of our communication would be slowed. And so a Carrington event might be a trigger for such an event, for a pandemic scale cyber event. And at NSPW, there was a little bit of a consensus that inadvertent effects might be the most likely cause of pandemic scale events. And Josiah and I were talking about this yesterday, and I'm a little skeptical about this inadvertent framing. And I recall that after 9/11, there was a lot of discussion of what was framed as a failure of imagination, that we didn't imagine people would do these things, and therefore we didn't prepare for them. And so, should we be focused on inadvertent events? And if not, if we should be focused on human-caused events, how do we avoid moving plotting and focus on the high likelihood causes of events? And with that, Josiah, do we want to go to the next? Chian says keeping social distance is much easier for a computer. Sort of yes, sort of no. That's a fascinating concept. I love it. Thank you. I remember Robert Morris used to like to say that to a first approximation, every computer is connected to every other computer in the world. And so maybe social distance, in one sense, computers are not motivated to seek out human contact, but they're also hyper connected through the internet.
It is
Josiah?
that computer people emphasize segmentation and isolation for sure. And this is the whole topic is a little bit of a can of worms, but imagine all of the iPhones get infected and you want to go to a restaurant and they want to inspect your iPhone to make sure that it isn't infected and it won't infect the other iPhones that are already inside the restaurant. I think that's a version of social distancing in the real physical world that would make people uncomfortable. I don't know what to do about that because, as we're going to talk about in a second, people are likely to have misinformation and us, if history is anything in the United States, a sense of privacy that they can make their own choices. What might that mean? So this is a fabulous question. Thanks for raising it.
And thanks, Yuri. I did not know my camera was off.
All right, shall we jump into the first one, Adam? Or I would invite anybody else that thinks, whoops, what have we missed here?
If I can, just two things. One, I'll just keep it to one thing for now. I really like that, the example of the iPhone. It reminds me of when ICBC, their U.S. subsidiary. So one of the main Chinese banks, their U.S. subsidiary got hit by ransomware, and the finance sector thought no big deal. It's who cares? It's just ICBC, but ICBC is one of the main buyers of treasuries. So they had to figure out, how do we cut out ICBC out of the system and yet still accept the trades from them? And it really is that, like, they had to accept flat files because they wouldn't accept any, they didn't want any connectivity of ICBC into places like DTCC or Bank of New York. So you really do get that quarantine sense. I bet everyone has some kind of example like that. But it was really interesting to hear exactly that, this, literally this quarantine situation about cutting a major market provider out of the markets. So thanks. I like how you framed that.
Bill, did you want to say any more about your comment there?
Well, I think that notion of social distance is kind of an interesting one if you play it through a little bit, which is, initially there was a thought that that was actually the cure because there was an assumption of the mode of transmission that it was large droplet, et cetera, right? And if we got 6 feet of distance, and there's still stickers, all over pavements and outside of buildings to this day that were somebody carefully measured out and put down every 6 feet. And later on, we learned, well, that's not actually true. And I think, in many cases, what we find in OT/IT settings where we think we have the quote unquote air gap, we're finding out that actually that's not really true. There's a presumption of that, but we've learned that there are modes of transmission that we didn't understand, like internet connected services and service contracts that come in through firewalls and other things that break an assumption. And so we have this notion of like we make an assumption about things for a period of time, but then as we learn more, we have to better inform our understanding, right? I think so I do think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about as a construct of just carrying it through. I think we didn't understand, for example, generally the notion of network-based worms when they were first striking, and the design emphasis was on connectivity, and then all of a sudden that connectivity was taken advantage of, and we got burned. So I think it's interesting to think about, like, to use this as a model for thinking about its application into this space.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Hans.
Like you were saying about all this social distancing, and the only way to avoid loneliness and isolation is I saw a computer engineering speech use these platforms during this time, this COVID time. As a computer engineer, I also saw this article on LinkedIn. With a computer, with different kinds of platforms like Zoom or Google Meet or anything, that it makes it easy to keep in touch with people.
The balancing act is really interesting, and thank you for pointing that out. It's something we're going to come to as we go forward, and I think I want to push Josiah a little bit. Thank you. To jump into the 6 lessons, and so we can have a little bit of a conversation about each.
Yeah, let me say a couple of words about this. Well, we'll do this for each, and then we can have the conversation as we go along. No need to wait until the end of presenting all of them. Again, as Adam said, these were 6 that we saw in that book that we thought were relevant. Now, one that this group has talked a lot about is statistics. And that came up for us as a pretty clear message in the biological COVID that having data, having healthcare surveillance, being able to see the spread of information, of disease, being able to tell how well are we doing? How well is this being managed? How many hospital beds are there? All of these trustworthy statistics really drove everything else. And it is imaginable that the same would be true in a cyber event. which, as we have discussed, right, CyberGreen has discussed, knowing how many devices there are, how many accounts, how many are infected versus not infected. If we don't have that information and we don't know how what we're doing, it's hard to create the countermeasures, to evaluate the countermeasures, and to sort of be prepared. So if we could move down the road of having more trustworthy statistics now, that would be useful for us now and useful for us in a pandemic. Any discussion on that particular item?
I think this is the group that is least likely to see this as any way controversial. So let's jump to the next one.
Fabulous. Do you want to talk about this, Adam?
Sure. So one of the lessons of the pandemic was the importance of informal networking, of connections that people had for the very most random of reasons. People who went to high school together got back together to talk about problems outside of any official channel of communication. And this is a lesson that goes way back in cyber as well. In fact, one of the classic papers on the Morris worm of 1988 talks about the importance of informal networks as part of the response mechanism. And I think one of the important questions to be aware of from the perspective of building a playbook and building a response mechanism is, what do we do if the internet is down? You know, the number of people who I talk to daily whose phone numbers I don't know is pretty large, right? I talk to them on Slack, I talk to them on email, but even if I had their phone numbers, the phone network today is largely hauled over the internet. So what are our backup communication mechanisms if people can't use the internet for more than a week? And is that a worthwhile critical infrastructure investment? You know, I jokingly put ham call signs in here. I don't have a ham radio myself, so I don't know.
I'll add a couple of things. One is that this doesn't discount formal structures, like ISACs are a good idea, and formal relationships are important. And COVID said they weren't enough, that there are these informal networks. Now, cyber has a lot of these, right? We have private Slack channels and whatevers. But how can we foster more of that? How can we recognize its value and make it sort of part of the culture? And I think there's nuance even to the internet being down, which would be a horrible thing. Will that happen? Probably someday. I can't imagine it won't happen, as resilient as it is. But what is the concept of prioritized service, right? In the same way that like certain members of the government have prioritized telephone service, even in a 9/11 kind of event, you want the people who are responding or can do the most management to have some ability to have out-of-band comms or prioritized comms. So that's what I wanted to add. Go ahead, Blake.
Thank you very much. This ties with both of the two lessons to some extent. So there was a huge public sector response to COVID-19 in some ways. And I think one of the things is that there was an enormous amount of hidden coordination between owners at a local level that isn't on the news. That the meetings and the coordination phone calls and the Google meetings that was occurring in the hidden background, utilizing all of these information technology systems to engage in those conversations. I think what's going to be really interesting in like that cyber pandemic event, like you were talking about, your communication systems fall apart. And so we're unable, we essentially go directly to local control until we can reestablish those lines of communication. And so it'll be really interesting to see how individuals try to network with their local agencies that they might not realize are trying to reestablish coordination at a larger scale. And so like very infrequently do I see a lot of individuals come out of the woodwork and say, hey, I'd like to help in an official to the official capacities. Like I never had a hacker reach out and say, hey, can I help in the pandemic? I'm like, I'd love that, but never had one. So it kind of ties to between the two is that there was the hidden networks also behind the scenes.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Josiah, do you?
My only comment is, if you read the paper, we talk about, for example, like your local CVS started to play a role, right? Or there were pharmacists who just had good ideas that, oh, maybe local vaccinations are going to be more effective than government provided. We should expect that too. Like, what is the role of your local Best Buy if all of the Android phones get bricked tomorrow? What is the role of local tech support? Not that we need to get them all sort of into a formal plan, but we should think about the opportunities of people like that, these sort of unexpected heroes.
All right, next slide. I'm just timekeeping a little. Do you want to talk about this one? Should I?
Yeah, I'm happy to say a couple of words.
Okay.
So there were playbooks in COVID. Like, people did have roles. It turns out that they didn't work well for a variety of reasons that have been well documented, like overlapping authorities or gaps in authorities or being usurped by people who just wanted control. That didn't help, right? If anything, it made it worse. And so if the internet goes out tomorrow, like who gets to make decisions? Is that CISA? Is it the White House? Is it a public company? Like, who directs what goes on? And knowing who would be in charge matters. You don't want to figure that out in the middle of the crisis. So at least having those conversations about who has authority in what aspects, it certainly won't be one, right? It's not going to be a perfect pyramid, but who gets to do, who will be responsible for the response, declaring the response, following up. We didn't have an answer here. We just raised it as a lesson from COVID. Thoughts about that one? Blake.
Thank you. So some really interesting thing, and I think I agree with you, is that who would own this is a really interesting question. There was some really obvious owners of the COVID-19 pandemic, at least at the local level. The local electeds were probably turning to their public health departments to kind of establish, oh, hey, there's a problem with some biological thing. Let's turn towards our health experts to kind of engage and own the event. I agree with you. It's not exactly clear. Maybe the local agencies might turn towards their like information technology departments as the owner. There are hidden networks still across the communities. Like, we have emergency management departments that would try to reestablish at least a semblance of local control. And in our minds, in the disaster space, we're always thinking about like all events start and end locally, and then like they work their ways up the chain through the different governmental structures. And we expect those agencies to be more support agents than operational agents. And so it'd be really interesting to see if CISA would try to own it, and I guess they could at a federal level, but like, how would I even communicate with that agency is super questionable in a communications failure, or in like an internet failure. And so I think you're on the right track with this. I don't know who would own this.
Yeah, thanks. I can imagine CISA having to deconflict with ONCD and maybe FEMA and lots of emergency organizations that do exist. And so, to some extent, CISA does have field offices. I don't know how well they can communicate with the state of Colorado, for example, like to help within the state, or who at a state level or local level would be responsible. Jason?
Thank you. First, CISA tried to do some of this because Solarium mandated, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission had legislation that came out that said CISA had to do continuity of the economy. And continuity of the economy wasn't just our area, but also like if you had to do a restart, and if you had to do a dark sky restart of the entire economy, like how do you do that? How to coordinate that would come. And they did a decent enough report, but basically CISA did not want to, actually CISA was doing an okay job. White House didn't really want to engage on it. And so if you go to the report, there's some of it. Basically CISA said, we're done after they did the initial reports. NSTAC had a report from 2014, actually 2 reports, that Chris Krebs was really involved with. I never thought I would say there's like this great NSTAC report you have to see, but they had 2 reports on mobilization. I put the one in on ICT mobilization. There was another one, I'm not sure how they compare, that was looking at this and saying, hey, you know, at some level, it can't be us at the AT&Ts and the Microsofts that are doing these prioritization decisions of, you know, do we bring back hospitals first or local police, or like that's an inherently political choice, and we have to have guidance at above a certain level. It was really good, well done work, and I popped that into the chat. I don't know whatever came of it, but I thought it was really interesting to come from NSTAC. If you're not familiar with NSTAC, for some of the listeners, they always call themselves the President's NSTAC, and it's been around for a couple of decades. Originally, it was for the Baby Bells, the AT&T company, you know, the AT&T companies. And so this was them that were saying, I thought it was really interesting them saying, hey, we need this guidance. And last, it was, I really like this on the roles and responsibilities. It gets to the formal and informal. Because I go back to Morris Worm, right? Before, you know, prior to Morris and running through Morris Worm, 1988, the people that were in charge of response, you basically use the internet to use the response. It was informal, and when it was out, they had no alternate means of communication. And after that, DoD came out and said, all right, we're going to fund a CERT. You know, we're going to, at Carnegie Mellon, we're going to do this. And I really liked that analogy of saying, hey, we had this catastrophe where you did see, you know, was it pandemic level? Probably not. Certainly not then. Would it be now? Maybe. But it's certainly this great example of how the informal networks succeeded where they failed because you didn't have a formal structure. A piece that we did at Atlanta Council in 2014 was looking at this, and we picked up an idea from from Microsoft that called for G20 plus an ICT 20. Now, Microsoft was arguing for that because they wanted to pursue norms. I liked the idea for response, right? If we were going to have this kind of meltdown that you're talking about, this kind of level event, who do we get together into the room to do the coordination? What structures do we have? A G20 plus an ICT 20. ICT 20, don't worry about the numbers, you know, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 40, but it would be the companies that would be most important to recovering from this kind of incident. And at least it's a structure. And we compared it to the credit meltdown of 2008, 2009, because the structures that we had in place, like the G7, like the IMF, like the Bank for International Settlements, were not nearly enough. But at least it gave a structure that you could say, all right, we at least have the foundation, then we can build on top of that. Right now, for this kind of level event, we don't even have the basics of that coordination. We don't have anything that would prove insufficient, and then we would build on top of it. There's really nothing to handle this. right? If we needed to get the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Britain and India, the President of the United States, together with the top 12 CEOs that are going to fix this, who convenes that? At least in 2008, 2009, you knew, okay, the head of the New York Fed is going to call everybody into a conference room and they're going to show up and, Lehman is going to live or die based on that. So I really, I appreciate this. I'll pop in that 2014 report I did into the chat because it was looking at the systemic risk. Thank you.
Blake, if I can just jump in before letting you respond, the thing I found really interesting about your comment juxtaposed with Jay's is you said that all emergencies start and end locally. And I think that the contrast of some of this is going to start and end in Redmond or Mountain View or Cupertino is an interesting difference between the cyber world and the physical world. But with that, please go ahead.
So Jason, I truly appreciate your perspective on this. At a national level, I believe that there probably would be competing organizational structures trying to fight for roles and responsibilities over the event. I would disagree that we don't have organizational structures to fight this. And the reason for that was like that priority reconnection is going to happen at a local emergency operations center, which is already a predefined structural response that we already have. What's kind of interesting, and this is an aside, is we're kind of talking about a hazard versus a dependency. And I'm still working through that in my own minds. Like cyber event incidents are a failure of a dependency, and hazards like wildfires are usually like this external threat that occurs. And I'm still working through that idea. But to kind of go back to you, like I disagree that there is nothing. At a national level, there will be competing orgs, but at a local level, there is already a very strong emergency response capability that is all hazards. So it would formalize, organize, coordinate, and prioritize its reconnection. So like this top-down guidance about like what should be reconnected first, we kind of already know that at the local level because we have like FEMA, we establish FEMA lifelines. These are like critical infrastructure organizations that create American society as we know it. And so like we kind of already have an idea of what systems we need to reconnect first. Because like we're going to be throwing out our amateur radio operators that are our backup systems and communicators. Like we'll go down to the lowest possible level of control and ask for additional resources at the state or national level. During COVID, it was really interesting because we couldn't really do that. Everyone dropped to local control immediately and no assistance was coming until like the vaccine started arriving or certain supplies because we couldn't really ask for everything because everyone was experiencing the emergency. So this one would be a really interesting because I think it would happen very closely to COVID, where it would drop to local control. Each local agency would have to prioritize for itself. Good news, we have that structure to prioritize. It's going to be really interesting is how do we get that guidance from the national level or from the state level in a communications failure? But there will be like, we are going to work our darndest to reestablish those communication structures. And we actually have some pretty robust and backup off-grid comms that allow us to communicate across the country. So slight disagreement, but I think you are right. Like it'll be a really interesting fight at the national level. Who owns this?
Yeah, and I'll be curious because there were real things that, for example, a pandemic or a natural disaster that takes out communications, like that at the local level is able to provide not just mitigations but solutions. And it's one thing that I work through and how much of it's a global cyber outage, whatever that means. I would think that fixing the problem is going to be that top down, right? Because in a way that it really wasn't necessarily had to be with pandemic or other areas, right? It's going to be the tech companies and the rest that are going to be owning the fix in that. Maybe maybe I think a stronger way than it possibly was in the pandemic, where in the pandemic, we were just waiting for them to provide the mitigation of the vaccines in a way that here, it's up to them to fix the actual technology plane. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but.
All right, I'm going to give Blake last word on this topic, which is fascinating and I think is going to drive an extension of the paper in some way. And we've got some additional topics we want to cover. So go ahead, Blake.
Jason, I truly appreciate your perspective on this. Like, you're thinking at that top level, and I'm thinking from this bottom level. Like, how do we communicate with the public? Because I'm not expecting Verizon to talk to my citizens. So like, it's going to be the locals saying, hey, turn off your cell phones. Like, we're going to put up sandwich boards, which we still do to this day, by the way. Like, stand in the middle of a park and talk about the wildfire that's happening nearby because you can't find any information online. So like, there's going to, that local public communication is still going to be owned at the local level. I agree with you. Like, these, like, I'm not going to be laying down ocean spanning, like, cables or anything like that. Like, that's not my job, but communicating with my citizens is. So like, really engaging those medical countermeasures for a cyber event or non-pharmaceutical interventions for a cyber event. We don't have those playbooks. I completely agree with the speakers here. Completely agree with that. And I'm thinking from the local level, going bottom up is how we recover from this, not top down. Top down will provide us some really strong solutions, but bottom up is how the public is going to go, what the heck is happening? Like, how are we engaging with this? And like, really thinking of this distributed decision making capability that a top down approach might miss, because I think it's going to be both working together and meeting in the middle somewhere. So thank you very much for this. I really appreciate all of this perspective.
I think that actually brings us to the point of communication. And here, I think there's a lot of desire for increased clarity, even in the physical world. You know, with COVID levels on the rise, should people be masking, say, in airports, at large conferences? I see a lot of discussion about these sorts of questions. You know, when should I get my vaccine? And I'm going to say that even though I have some of those questions, I think the world of actual public health does a phenomenal job of communication in comparison to the technology world. And so we know that we need clear and effective communication. We know that we need people to be told what it is they need to do. And getting those messages out without the internet, and Blake, I love that you were talking about standing in parks and putting out sandwich boards. I don't know any cybersecurity advice that fits on a sandwich board. And so I think that how we get to clear and effective communication is important. But Josiah, I'm tempted, just looking at the time, to push on to the next one. Do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, maybe we try and group a couple of these together. We've
Sure.
talked about a lot of the communication things already, like what if the internet isn't available, and does bad advice make things worse? Glad to keep that continuing. I think the sixth of the six is this one, which we have touched on earlier, that COVID had playbooks. They didn't work as well as anybody wanted. And what does that mean? Does it mean there weren't enough? Does it mean they weren't updated enough? What came out at the NSPW conversation last week was that there's probably not just one. We maybe oversimplified in saying a playbook is enough. That's probably not true. Consider the fact that a natural disaster, a Carrington event, is very different than an accident that takes down a bunch of technology or malware that just spreads inadvertently. Those playbooks aren't the same. That wouldn't be helpful. The same is true for the playbook at Microsoft being different than the playbook at Google, or any companies or states, right, are going to be somewhat different. That bears worth, that bears more thinking. There are certainly cyber plans. I think cyber people are good at playbooks, right? We have playbooks for malware, we have playbooks for outages, for insider threats. And so at least we have a little bit of experience here, but we think there needs to be more. Probably at least at the government level. Like we've already talked here about like the bottom up and the top down. Both groups probably need to get together and actually talk this out, because now is a good time to do it. So that's where I'll leave that. Go ahead, Blake.
I completely agree with you. We're missing these playbooks. There's something that from the disaster crisis response side, I've been trying to figure out. Like, I see these playbooks and they're very tactical. Sometimes they're extremely technical documents, and I go, oh, I'm trying to read like how firewall rules should work, and I'm not a firewall guy. And so like something that I've been really trying to like parse is there's strategy documents that we're starting to see. There's tactical documents that we're starting to see. In crisis response, we use like heuristics. We use plans in slightly different ways than I'm seeing my cyber counterparts, because I'm trying to learn from both sides. I think there's great stuff that cyber folks have put out there that we could learn from. And so like we build these all hazards heuristics where we build constructions and skeletons of organizational and coordination processes. And then we don't even care what the actual hazard is. Yeah, maybe we have like a page on the hazard specifically. Hey, in a wildfire, you might want to evacuate. During a public health event, you're not evacuating. But there are some kind of like strategic level documents that can provide us heuristics for responding to a cyber event, where it might be like the heuristic is just turn it off, turn off the machine. Or what are those like heuristical like behavioral changes that we could implement at the person level that would allow us to respond to this event? And so I completely agree. Like I've been working on like the local public health cyber strategy to kind of like think about how do we manage a cyber attack at a community level that's at a healthcare agency, because a lot of guidance is talking about the healthcare agency response and incident response, and I completely agree that's necessary. But at a community level, when I'm looking above them and thinking about the whole community, like how do I strategically manage the cyber incident at that level, and what should I be doing to support them? And we just don't have that guidance yet, but it's getting there. It's getting there. So we'll see.
I was in a conversation yesterday in which we were talking about the response of healthcare to the Change Healthcare event of disconnect everything, and how that turned out to be precisely the wrong response that broke a lot of things. And so I think that developing those heuristics in advance so that we're not trying to figure it out as we go in the midst of a crisis is just tremendously important.
And we can make those heuristics actually counterintuitive, interestingly enough. We can make those heuristics be both maintain connection and disconnect, and allow the incident responders, the incident managers, the emergency operations centers to really select the specific tactic that works for that situation. It would be nice if we could have a heuristic that works for everything, but welcome to emergency management, everything depends. So it's just like, what are those different heuristics that we can say, hey, here are the levers that you could pull to respond to this event? And that's what playbooks are really for, is like, okay, turn everything off, keep everything connected. Those are two counter arguments, but it might be the way to say, oh, in this instance, let's keep everything connected. In this instance, let's turn everything off, or something like that.
All right. Josiah, I want to get to 2 slides forward. So maybe let's go very quickly through the syndemic thing, which
Why don't you
is...
just say a word about it, and then we'll leave the discussion for later.
Yeah. The overlapping issues of disadvantaged communities getting hit worse by these things is a problem that we will face. but I really wanted to get to the next slide, so we'll take comments on that in chat, in email, in Slack. But I wanted to get thoughts. You know, in our paper, we talked about the playbook, and really, I think this conversation has led me to think we need to revise that to playbooks. But what other approaches should we be focused on? And, you know, I'm just going to leave that. I'm going to ask that one and open it up. Wow.
So I think, you know, I know that you didn't you put a note in there about the disinformation and trust comment, but I really do feel like there's a big, significant role to play in any playbook around how we're going to handle that. Like, if you think about, for me, the enormous frustration of the pandemic was, the confusion, sown confusion that happened around what were effective treatments, what was working, and I think people in a period of desperation were trying to seek out authoritative sources wherever they were, and whoever seemed to sound more authoritative or had the bully pulpit seemed to be able to drive a particular response, even if it was actually really not good. And so, I've seen that. Like, if you go to the example that you brought up, Adam, with change, the American Hospital Association told its members disconnect from change. It wasn't about, without really understanding anything about the nature of the attack, and in essence set up a giant industry-wide DOS of services, and that really was difficult for many of the organizations to come back from. Like they didn't then have a method by which they could transact, and they didn't, and so it's very easy to disconnect. It's very hard to reconnect, and so I wonder if the playbook, there's really a whole need to kind of think about, if there was a large crisis, there would be a lot of panic on the cyber front. And I think that we would need to have very clear communication, and even in the public health sphere, right? The organizations that we expected to be authoritative were attacked, the CDC, the NIH. And so if I think about like what happens here, and we're going to see this, I fear, in November, is that CIS is going to get castigated because it's going to say, well, you didn't help us on election security. We don't trust it, right? We're going to have, if there was a large banking crisis, who would be the authoritative voice who would actually be able to talk about the way to best handle this so that people could reestablish trust in the banking system or in any other critical infrastructure? And that's what I really think that those are, that communication is an amplification problem. And we need to have ways of dealing with it and dampening it.
Excellent point. We do deal with this today in cybersecurity, where there is a tremendous amount of bad advice, and yeah.
And I think Jason's, that the outrage, right, construct is something that we use, this risk equals hazard plus outrage. And, it's like, I do think it is something that we have to kind of be thinking about it as much as what would we be doing from a technical response perspective, because we could do the right technical things, but yet have our efforts thwarted or undone by behaviors that are misdirected.
All right, maybe we'll give the second to last word to Blake. I want to say a few things in closing, and then I know Josiah has one more slide that we're excited to share.
Thank you. This is an incredible conversation to see from the other side. I think that we're nearing a convergence event where we have like crisis managers who are engaged on emergency management topics are now starting to see cybersecurity hazard as a community hazard, not as just a hazard of the agency. And so as we head towards this convergence event, I really encourage that we establish clear and common language that is probably easier to adopt emergency management, crisis management communications, like through the Comprehensive Planning Guidebook 101 or the cyber process when we're talking about risk, threat, and hazard or dependencies, that we're using the common vernacular of current emergency crisis planners so that we can use that language to communicate with them, to build a common core, to build a collective whole community approach to cyber events. And so that's my recommendation. And I think that the previous speaker was talking about how I think we're at this heroic stage of medicine with regards to cybersecurity. Lots of opinions, lots of people who have particular opinions, like this is how we should manage it, and we're following them for right now. That's not a bad thing, but like it's I think that this cybersecurity space is really starting to develop into its own with regards to meta level strategies like containment, mitigation, and suppression strategies, like really starting to move to that meta level rather than just the tactical response of turn off the firewalls, implement these group policy rules. I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I appreciate everyone who's been joining in. I want to mention that we have a Slack channel where we can continue these conversations and cross-connect. I've posted the link into the Zoom chat if you don't have it, and we have an email list where we will be sending you notifications about future events, because as Blake was saying, the opportunity to cross-pollinate with people who have interrelated ideas is so powerful. We're really excited about it. And before we let you go on time, Josiah, do you want to jump to the last slide, which I just think is a fun way to close out for today?
Yeah, sure. This is a 30-second anecdote, which is after Adam and I wrote this paper, I very blindly sent it off to somebody who I never thought would read it or reply. And that person was Anthony Fauci. And Anthony Fauci wrote me back. Which I never expected. He read the paper, he liked it. He actually sent us a link to a COVID lessons paper he wrote that we didn't know about, that we ended up including in ours because it was shockingly aligned. And so this was a very pleasant surprise. I don't think he wouldn't be able to pick me out of a lineup at all, but we felt good about it. So I just wanted to share that.
Indeed. So with that, wanted to say thank you all for your time, your enthusiasm, and we look forward to seeing you next month. We will be announcing who is speaking soon, and please continue the conversation in Slack. With that, have a wonderful day all.